As I walked through the Hermitage by myself without Galena, I seemed to have a premonition of my past life. I walked up and down the staircases, marveling at the architecture, and I had this feeling that someone was with me.
Bring your imagination to life with inspiring stories of an incredible and very real world.
The story behind the story is often just as, if not more, fascinating for me. I want to know sometimes more details about the supporting characters than just the main ones. What brought pen to the paper at the moment where the story started? That was how Russia was presented to me. As a small child, I learned about a prince and a princess, both young and in love, with a family ruling this humongous country, and suddenly their lives were cut short and they went missing. A small child doesn't understand politics, nor does he care. So my only option to learn the story as to why it ended that way was to go to the history books. And I spent 30 years learning the history, culture, and intimately the family, to the point where I now believe that if you believe in a past life, I had to have been Russian before this life, because the level of fascination I have with Russia is uncanny. After 30 years of research, I got a chance to go to Russia and go to where the story started and ended for me. Everything that I saw on that trip in a week and a half spoke to me spiritually. And I'm not a religious person, but I had a spiritual experience in Russia. Whether it was the Romanoff Sarcophagi at the Peter and Paul Fortress in the cathedral, or Catherine's Palace, or the Summers Palace, Peter's Palace, more commonly known as Peterhof, or even the Hermitage, I had an experience every single place that I went. Now, I also know that Russians seem to be a little hesitant in opening up to outsiders. So I knew I couldn't tell my guide Galena that I was a Russian enthusiast right off the bat. I had to tell her slowly and deliberately so that I wasn't overwhelming and maybe just a little bit overbearing. The first place she took me was the Romanoff Sarcophagi, and she started to get a little bit of an interest in me and my knowledge when sometimes I would finish her sentences or even add to the story. She began to notice that I wasn't the typical tourist and kind of snickered a little bit when I sneered at one of the sarcophagi, and she asked me why I did such a thing, and I said, because I know he wasn't buried there originally. And she asked me what the story was, and the story was that Catherine the Great had deposed of her husband, Peter III, and when her court or her cronies had him killed, she buried him in a local monastery. But their son, Paul, who hated her guts, after 34 years of waiting to rule, was so resentful of her that he reburied his father, Peter III, next to Catherine as a divine joke. And she said I had the story spot on. She knew then that I wasn't the typical tourist. By the time we got through the cathedral and went through every one of the sarcophagi and talked about every single one of them, we stood at the velvet rope to the room that held the sarcophagi, holding or marking the remains of the family found in the forest in Yekaterinburg, that prince and that princess, and their 5 children. She let me know that 2 of the children are still not recognized by the Holy Orthodox Church of Russia, and so their remains are actually not underneath the sarcophagi. But they are known that they are actually the remains of those 2 children, but there is no way that they can be confirmed due to the religious laws. The next place was the Cathedral of the Savior on Spilled Blood. Not just the story about its construction, on the site of the assassination of one of the czars, but also of its history in the Soviet era. The church itself is the largest collection of mosaics in the world, but it fell into disrepair when the Soviets took over, turning into a theater storage room, a farmer's market, and during the siege of Leningrad, a morgue. But between the siege and the 1980s, it stayed abandoned and fell apart. Not until the 1980s, when a roof inspection crew was on the roof and discovered a unexploded Nazi gun shell lodged in the roof, did the city government start to think about maybe we should restore this place. And since then, it has undergone constant renovation to bring it back to its former glory. As I walked through the Hermitage by myself without Galina, I seemed to have a premonition of my past life. I walked up and down the staircases, marveling at the architecture, and I had this feeling that someone was with me. In my mind's eye, I could see somebody in court dress of the 1700s walking up the staircase with their diplomats. And as I got to one of the hallways and looked out the window toward the Neva River, I seemed to feel as if I was looking out of Peter the Great's eyes. It was as if he was wanting to show me his palace, and the palace that Catherine would fill with so much art that if you spent 30 seconds looking at each item, you would spend 8 years in. But the most impactful spots, besides the Romanoff Sarcophagi, were Peter's palace and Catherine's palace. The summer palace at the edge of the Gulf of Finland that Peter had built and that was destroyed by the Germans in World War II. The entire castle was utterly destroyed, so everything you see now is a reconstruction. Going through, it's kind of a letdown because you're not allowed to take any pictures, but yet you can't take pictures because even though it is private property, and that's the reason why, you're pretty much shoveled through like cattle. And I could just do nothing but listen to Galina as she told me things about the things that we were seeing. But for me, once I got out into the gardens, that was where the real story started for me. Learning about the trick gardens that Peter the Great had set up for his wandering party guests. If they wandered too far away from the party, they could inadvertently trigger a fountain that would completely drench them. And when they would go past or go back to the party, Peter would see them drenched and soaking wet and cold and have a hearty belly laugh at their experience. Or going to the edge of the Gulf of Finland where he had his Montplaisir palace on the same property. And standing on the edge of the Gulf of Finland, I had a moment that transcended time. I had to remind myself that this was the first time I had been out of the country, out of the U.S. And here I was in Russia, looking out at Finland. And I started to notice that Galina and I were starting to forge, after a few days, a friendship that transcended borders. It was amazing to know that people could not have to abide by the narratives that we told each other about the other culture. As we walked back to the palace, she would tell me about the fountain along the path that had a slightly darker story, and that if it went off on your way to the Montplaisir Palace, you were most likely in trouble, because if the fountain went off, that meant Peter was having a meeting at the palace. And if you walked in soaking wet, he would hand you a chalice filled with vodka, and you had to down it in one fell swoop. And if you didn't keep track or keep pace with Peter's drinking, you might die of alcohol poisoning. That is the ultimate penalty for tardiness. But the next day, we would go to Catherine's palace, where my story started with that prince and princess. And as we would go through the palace, Galina's phone rang nonstop. After about the fourth or fifth call, she happened to end the phone call and apologize to me, saying, "I'm so sorry, people keep calling me because it's my birthday and they just want to wish me happy birthday." I told her that in the US, that is almost like a de facto holiday, and I couldn't, in my mind, wrap my head around that this perfect stranger was spending her birthday with another perfect stranger and not with her family. And that brought 4 days of learning about this wonderful soul with me to fruition. As we would leave the palace, I started to cry, but not knowing how Russians would appreciate a total stranger showing emotion, I tried my best to hold it back. And after a few minutes, Galina had our driver stop to get me a drink from the local gas station. And as the driver was gone, she turned back to me and said, "Spill it. I know something's wrong. What's wrong?" But I still couldn't bring myself to tell her that I had found a friend that I felt like I was never going to see again. But by the time we reached my hotel, I couldn't bear it any longer. When she said goodbye, I said "S dnем рождения," or "Happy Birthday," and my eyes glassed over once more. She knew that I had made an impact on her and her me, and said, "Let me hold you," and we hugged. The next year I was in Tallinn for an education conference and decided to take a train back to St. Petersburg so I could see my friend Galina again. While I was there for just the weekend, she took me to the Siege Museum, since after our 4-day trip the previous year, I had absorbed everything I could find on the siege itself after her and I had such riveting conversations about it prior. We went through the museum, learning more about the fate of the city, how the city survived over 900 days of siege, and just the immense level of humanity, perseverance, and slightly dark humanity, the darkest parts of humanity. Learning about siege chocolate that was carpenter's glue mixed with other sawdust and other types of chemicals to make what was called chocolate but had no nutritional value, or siege bread made primarily of sawdust and wallpaper paste with no nutritional value. And then finally we heard an actual recording of the heartbeat of Leningrad, a simple metronome tone. That was used to say that Leningrad was still alive. I had heard it on movies before, but actually standing there listening to an actual recording brought yet another spiritual experience. I would then go to Piskorovskoye Cemetery, which was the main mass grave, and walking along somewhere up to 750,000 to 1 million graves, I felt a weight on me and an even stronger connection to the city. I often say that Seattle is the emerald of my heart, playing on its moniker of the Emerald City, but I say that St. Petersburg is the city of my soul.
Thank you for joining us on another audio adventure right here at Wandertale, the travel podcast community. Subscribe to our channel to stay tuned for more travel stories from around the world and share tales with the open-minded, the brave, and the curious.